Thank you very much. So I will talk about how to characterize functional connectivity subnetwork contribution in a narrative classification using Shapley values. So first I want to introduce myself. I'm Italian, and so I did my bachelor and master degree at the University of Verona in applied mathematics. Then I moved to France, in particular in Nice, with an Erasmus Plus program, and then I stayed there for a PhD in computer science under the supervision of David Coudert, and the topic of my PhD were temporal graph, neuroscience, and machine learning. Then in October, I moved here to join the Professor Mutzel lab as a postdoc. Um, and the topic of my postdoc will be trying to find the similarity between molecules. So it's a problem of temporal graph similarity applied to chemistry. And so my research interests lie in three main directions. So there is the computational neuroscience direction, in which I'm interested in brain dynamics, so how the brain works, and I model the brain functionality as a temporal graph. Then I'm interested in machine learning, and in particular, I'm interested in graph neural networks for temporal data, so for temporal graph neural network. And in this context, I did two summer of code, one with Google and one with Julia, where I contributed to the open source software graph neural network.jl, which is Julia package for deep learning on graph. So you can build graph neural network, train graph neural network, and create also a custom graph neural network. And now I'm a maintainer of this package, which was created by Carlo Lucibello, which is a professor at the Bocconi University in Italy. And then I'm interested also in computational chemistry, and as I said before, now I'm trying to find similarity between the molecular dynamics. So basically, how a molecule change the position and their conformation with time, and also in this case using temporal graph methods. And so I say that I joined the Professor Mutzel lab, which is the computational analytic group, also called the COAN group. And this group focuses on the ways to analyze large data using computers, and in particular using algorithm theory, machine learning, and statistics. And then we collaborate with some experts of the field in which we apply the theory. And the current research topic are temporal graph, graph learning, graph similarity, and in particular the graph edit distance, which is way to, for example, in this picture, is a way to find the similarity between two graphs in a way in which we try to transform one graph to the other with a minimum number of simple operations, such as removing or adding nodes or edges. Then in the group there is interest in combinatorial optimization, using also machine learning and integer linear programming. And the current application of all these topics are chemistry, cartography, and geodesy. So this is the group. We took this photo today, and so it's a very updated one. And so it's composed by Professor Mutzel, Professor Suarez. She's interested in high-performance computing and modular supercomputing architecture. Then there is the secretary, Christiane Stucke, and three PhD student. Laura, she's interested in especially in graph at this distance. Then Daniel, that is interested in graph partitioning and connected subgraph problems. Philippe is interested in higher order Lagrange optimization and surveillance problem. And then there's me. And today I want to talk about a project that I did during my PhD, which is about computational neuroscience. So I want to first introduce you what is computational neuroscience. It is a field which is interdisciplinary and use some mathematical, computational, and theoretical approach to understand the nervous system. And the nervous system is composed by the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. But I'm mainly interested in the brain, which is also called cerebrum, which is the one displayed in this figure. But in the field, there are several ways to understand the nervous system from different point of view. So you can study the nervous system from the point of view of its development, the structure, the physiology, so the function, and the cognitive abilities. And I'm interested in understanding the physiology of the cerebrum, which now I will call it brain for simplicity. And so there are several ways to observe the brain. And now I want to show you the most famous one. So the first one is the magnetic resonance imaging technique, which is that machine. You enter in a tunnel where there is a magnetic field, and it captures the structure of the brain. And this method has a very high spatial resolution. In fact, you can see here 3 different images of the brain using 3 different machines that generate different magnetic field. And the most powerful one is the one with 11.7 Tesla. In fact, you can see the difference between the first image that has just 3 Tesla and the level of details of the last one. But to study the functionality of the brain, we can use the same machine. And in this case, we say that it's the functional magnetic resonance technique that measure indirectly the brain activity using the Bolt signal. So the Bolt signal, it's the blood oxygenation level dependent signal, which is complicated measure that take in account different aspects in the brain area. For example, it measures how much oxygen there is in a part of the brain and the blood volume. And so, yeah, something like that. And in this case, the spatial resolution is still high, but the temporal resolution, which means how many photo frame of the brain activity are taken by the machine, is low. So this is very good when we want to understand the location of the brain activity. And then the last method I want to show you is the electroencephalogram, also called EEG, which is a casket with several electrodes. And in this case, the temporal resolution is very high, but the spatial resolution is low because there are just few electrodes in this casket. But this method measures directly the brain activity. So how we can model mathematically the brain activity? We can use graph. So a graph is a mathematical structure to represent the connection between objects, and it's composed by vertices which represent the object or the entity of the graph, and the edges are the connection between the pair of vertices. And for example, with graph, you can represent a lot of real networks, real situation, such as a network of people. So the nodes are a person, and then the edges are the relation between them. But in our case, we want to use this mathematical structure to model the brain activity. But given the fact that the brain activity has the component of time, temporal graphs are suitable to model the activity. And so the vertices are the brain region, and the edges are the interaction between the region. But on the GIF on top, you can see a very simple temporal graph, and each time is a time step, and you can call this frame windows or snapshot. And here is a way to represent a temporal graph with the adjacency tensor, which means that the column and the rows represent the brain region, and then in this case is a complete graph. So between every couple of nodes there is an edge, but it's weighted, which means that we have a value associated to each edge. And in this case, the weight is the correlation among the activation of brain areas. And now we will see how to construct a temporal graph starting from the raw data that are the output of the MRI machine. So the pipeline has 4 steps, and now we will see them in detail. So we start with the raw data, which is a time series for each voxel of the brain. A voxel is a 3D pixel, and depending on the resolution of the machine, you have different amount of voxel. The one I worked with contains around 1 million of voxels. So for each voxel, we have an associated time series that is the bold signal of that voxel. As you can see, the time series is a bit noisy, and this is because the patient can move a bit, and also there is the involuntary movement caused by the cardiac and respiratory system. And so the first step is to clean, to remove the noise from this time series using a linear regression and bandpass filtering. And so we obtain, for example, 1 million of clean time series. Given the fact that it's a huge amount of data, we group time series together using a brain atlas. So a brain atlas is a division, a parcellation of the voxel of the brain in a region of interest, in areas that have some common characteristics, in also according to different criteria, such as there are some brain atlas that divide the brain according to structural criteria, and some atlas that divide the brain according to functional criteria. And in this case, we use a brain atlas that divides the brain in 100 regions. And so for each of these regions, we have a clean signal that is the average of all the time series within the voxel in that area. And after this, we apply the sliding window method, which is a method to create the graph. So for each pair, for each couple of brain areas, we look at their time series, and then we superpose a window. And within the window, we compute the Pearson correlation coefficient that will be the edge, the weight edge of the graph. And so we repeat this for each pair of brain region, and we obtain the first JCC matrix. So we insert the value for each couple of brain areas, and then we repeat the process by shifting the window. So there are several ways you can overlap or not overlap the window, depending on the task and the application. And then we repeat the process. And so we compute the Pearson correlation within the window for every pair of brain region, and we obtain a second adjacency matrix. And so we continue to repeat this until we cover the whole time series, and we obtain the temporal network. So in the project we used a dataset that is an fMRI dataset that contained the brain recording of 31 subjects that were engaged in a narrative task. So a narrative task is a task in which the subject is exposed to a discourse in which there are several events and several persons that are involved, and study the narrative task. It's interesting because it's the way in which people interact and exchange information, and it's a very natural task. And so our narrative can be divided in according to two criteria. The first one is the modality. So we have 8 movies and 8 audios. So basically, the patient or would just listen to something, to a narrative, or listen and watching. And then we can divide the narrative by the content. So 8 narratives were about, so the script, the topic was about a restaurant situation, and 8 about airport situation. And the dataset is balanced across the 2 modalities. And so we wanted to answer to the question which brain areas are the most important, the most involved in a narrative task. And to do that, we used a machine learning model to classify these 2 aspects. And then we use an explainable AI technique which are the Shapley values, to understand which brain areas were the most important in the classification, so in the task. And then we analyze the result to have insight on how the brain process narrative. So the state of the art of this project is that there are several papers that try to classify some aspect of fMRI data, but they try to do that prioritizing the accuracy of the model, but they don't look at the explanation on the decision making of the model. Then there are some papers that use the same dataset we used, but they were looking just at a certain part of the brain and not the whole brain. And then, of course, Shapley values were already used in brain networks, but they were used to understand the importance of brain areas, but in a context of MRI. So when we look at the structure of the brain and not the function of the brain. And so we created a very simple model that takes as input the adjacency tensor. So one adjacency tensor represents the activity of the brain during a narrative of one subject. And we apply a 3D convolutional network. So the filter dimension as a 3 dimension, and the first 2 dimensions match the dimension of the a snapshot, a window, and instead the third one we optimize the parameter, and then we apply a max pooling and a multi-layer perceptron to have the answer. And so now I'll show you animation about the 3D convolution. So the filter is the shifting part that is superposed to, in this case, the third dimension is 2, and is superposed to our input, and at each superposition is computed the component-wise multiplication. And if the number of channel is 1, then we have one number at each time. And instead, if the number of channel is higher, we obtain, as you can see before, a vector for each shifting. And so these are the classification results. So we take an input, the temporal graph, and we classify first the modality. So we could guess with our model if was about if the patient was listening or watching a movie, and the accuracy is very high. And then we classify the content, so if it was an airport or restaurant situation, and then we also did the four-class classification. So we try to guess both if was audio about an airport situation, for example. And you can see that it's easier to guess the modality instead of the content. And then we also perform some permutation in order to understand the importance of the time. And so we took our data, so our temporal network, and we shuffle with the permutation on the inputs, and we change randomly the windows, so the time step. And as you can see, it affects more the accuracy on the content, which is quite natural, is what we were expecting. And we didn't reach the random accuracy because within each window there is still a bit of information about the time. And then we also permuted so we completely destroyed basically the time series. So if you remember at the beginning on our pipeline, we had the time series. So we shuffled the time series, and then we created the graph. And in this case, you can see that there are random accuracy. The model cannot, it's not able to distinguish between the condition. And then we also created the static functional connectivity graphs, which means that in the pipeline, when we create the graph, in the last part where there is the creation of the graph, instead of creating small window and shifting them, we create just a big window that cover the whole time series. So we have just an adjacency matrix. And we use that as input of the model, and you can see that the performance are lower, but not so it's we can take more point in accuracy if we use the temporal graphs. And now I want to show you another division of the brain that we used to understand which part of the brain was the most important in this classification. And so we, as I said before, we divide the brain in 100 regions, but then we use another division, a parcellation, which is the yellow parcellation that divided the brain in 7 and 17 subnetwork with some common functionality. And now I will show you the function of the 7 subnetwork, so areas. And we have the visual subnetwork, which is at the back of our head, and is responsible for processing static and moving object, so the visual information. Then we have the somatomotor subnetwork that is responsible for process motor and emotional stimuli. Then we have the dorsal attention subnetwork, which is involved in tasks in which we have to integrate video and audio stimuli. Then there is the ventral attention that is involved in sensor task. Then we have the limbic one, which is at the bottom of our head and is involved in tasks such as memory, learning, and motivation. Then there is the control subnetwork that is involved in tasks such as the decision making and problem solving task. And the last one is the default subnetwork that is involved in story comprehension, daydreaming, and thinking about others. And so, as I mentioned before, we use Shipley values to understand which brain areas were the most important. But Shipley values were introduced in game theory field, and in particular, it's a way to quantify the contribution of players in a coalition game. So a coalition game is a game in which player can form coalition to achieve a common goal, and we want to understand which player was the most important one. So this is the formula to compute the contribution of player I with respect to payoff function, so the contribution of the player. And we consider all the players except the one that we want to know its contribution, and we look at all the possible subset of players, and we consider the contribution of the coalition when there is the player and when there is not the player we are considering at the moment. And so this function gives us the whole contribution of a player. And in our case, we have that the players are brain areas, and the contribution of a coalition or a brain area is the model accuracy when we consider just that area. And to consider just a subset of the brain, we mask the areas by setting to 0 the entry of the adjacency matrix that correspond to that area, because I remember you that the rows and the column correspond to brain areas, so it's a way to cover them, to eliminate them. And so these are the results. So we performed that for each classification. So we start with the modality classification, and we can see that the Shipley values on the surface of the brain and on a bar plot. And for the modality, so when we are classifying between audio and movie, the most influential subnetwork is the visual one, and this is quite intuitive. because in a task we are just listening, in another we are listening and watching. Then we have the content classification task. So we are distinguishing between airport and restaurant situation, and we have that the default subnetwork, which is known to be involved in story comprehension task, is the most important one. But also we have a new result. In the Baldassano et al. Paper, they were suggesting that there was an open question, and they were suggesting that the temporal parietal network is important when we receive new stimuli that are narratives. And I want to describe you how we process new information. So there is this theory in which there is the top-down processing and bottom-up processing. So the top-down processing is a way in which we receive new information, and to elaborate them, we use our knowledge and our prior expectation. And this is associated with the dorsal attention subnetwork. But then there is the opposite, in which which is the bottom-up processing. When we receive new stimuli, instead of using our previous knowledge, we build on top of them, and so this is associated with temporal parietal subnetwork and ventral attention. And so our result is a step further in answering to this step to the Baldassano question, in which when we receive a narrative stimuli, it's not just a top-down process, but it's also a bottom-up one. It's a mix of them. And then we have the combined classification results. So we are guessing, okay, it's an audio about an airport situation, and the results are mix of the previous one. So again, the most influential subnetwork are the visual and the temporal parietal one. This project has some limitation, and the first limitation, of course, when we work with machine learning, is that we have a small data set with respect to the standard one. So, for example, the NIST data set has 60,000 of data points. Instead, in our work, we have just less than 500 samples. And this is because it's very complicated to have a big data set about brain functionality, because using fMRI machine is very costly. And then we have another limitation, which the computing the Shapley value in exact way is very computational expensive. So in this work, we propose a method to identify which brain areas are the most involved in a task, and some possible extension of this work is to apply this method in case in which is completely unclear which brain areas are important in a task. And then it would be nice to analyze other components of the temporal network, such as the connection. So instead of masking the brain areas, we would like to mask the edges, so the connection between them, to understand which brain areas are, which connection between brain areas are the most important one. And to do that, we just have to mask the edges between two brain areas. There is a question? No. Okay. And yeah, and then in another data sets, such as the problem solving task, would be nice to analyze the moment the most important moment in a problem, in a decision-making process, for example. And so in this case would be to understand which window, which time step in the temporal network is the most important one. And then, of course, we would like to use a larger dataset and other dataset to explore the generalizability of the neuroscience results. So there are some opportunities in our team. So, for example, for master thesis project in, for example, extending this work, and also there are some open position as student assistant. And instead, if you are interested in software part, there is the opportunity to participate to the Google Summer of Code of next year, and especially if you want to contribute to the Graph Neural Network.jl package, you can write to me or to Professor Mutzel, and to be so the Google Summer of Code is a program which is very selective, and Google supports the student to work during the summer to contribute to open source software, and you have to be a student that is a beginner in contributing to open source software, but to be selected already from now, you have to start to try to contribute to the library, for example. So if you are interested, you can write to me. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
So I would have a question regarding the way in which the data was collected.